Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we tear through complex research so you can get the maximum insight in minimal time. Our focus today is really cutting-edge, deep generative models, or DGMs, and their immense potential to fundamentally change how we study, manage, and even predict transportation systems.
And this is such a critical topic right now because the existing standard in transportation modeling is really starting to hit a wall.
When you say the existing standard, you mean things like CNNs, RNNs, the models most people in the field are already using.
Exactly. You look at what we currently use, the CNNs for classifying traffic, RNNs for forecasting, GNNs for network analysis. These are all what we call discriminative models. They're effective, sure, but they only ever learn the conditional probability.
Okay, so let's translate that a bit. When we say conditional probability, we mean they're great at answering a very specific question, like, given this input data, what's the likelihood of this specific outcome?
Precisely. They are, in a way, stuck in the rearview mirror. They need labeled historical data, and they're inherently confined to patterns they've already seen. So if your training data has never included a really specific, chaotic three-car pileup or a truly novel kind of traffic shockwave, the model simply cannot predict it. It can't generate it. It lacks the ability to capture the full blueprint of the system, the entire underlying data distribution.
And that's the crucial limitation, right? Because in transportation, uncertainty is the only constant. And those rare events, the accidents, the major congestion, they're the most costly.
They are. Relying only on what you've seen is just inadequate.
So this is where DGMs step in. They don't just predict an outcome. They learn that complete blueprint, which allows them to, well, almost invent the future.
They get the superpower to generate brand new, complex, and statistically realistic scenarios that might have never, ever occurred in your original data set. The payoff isn't just academic. It's about control, safety, proactive planning.
So over this deep dive, we're going to unpack the fundamental trade-offs between the main DGM architectures, we're talking VAEs, GANs, flows, and diffusion models, and see how they stack up when applied to real transportation data.
Yeah, from simulating household travel all the way to generating these high-fidelity traffic flows.
Let's start with the central objective that unites all these models. When you're training any DGM, you're basically running a sophisticated modeling contest. You're trying to minimize the difference between the true distribution of traffic reality and the distribution your model is, well, guessing.
That's a great way to put it. We quantify that difference, that discrepancy, and the practical goal is what we call maximum likelihood estimation.
You're trying to find the internal settings, the parameters, that make the real-world traffic data you've observed seem as probable as possible under your model's worldview.
Exactly. You're trying to convince the model that its generated world is indistinguishable from the real world.
So once you start successfully capturing that reality, what are the key benefits that immediately pop up for transportation planners and researchers?
Well, the benefits really fall into three major buckets. The first and most obvious one is synthetic data generation. And this capability, it solves several massive problems right off the bat. It allows for data augmentation to cover those rare safety-critical scenarios that are so hard to capture in the real world. And it's a huge safeguard for privacy.
Wait, how does it handle privacy? That seems like a huge deal.
It is. By generating synthetic mobility data, you can preserve all the vital statistical properties like, average journey times, peak travel hours, common travel modes, without including any personally identifiable information from the original subjects.
Wow. So you can share data and collaborate without compromising privacy.
It opens the door for so much more collaboration.
Okay, that's a massive benefit. What's the second one?
The second is probabilistic inference. Because DGMs model the inherent uncertainties in the entire system, they move us past these single deterministic forecasts.
So instead of just saying traffic will be slow, it's more nuanced.
Much more. They can say there is a 15% probability of a multi-hour blockage on the I-40 due to these three factors, and here are the likely detours. It fundamentally improves robust decision-making.
So you're building resilience into the system by preparing for a whole spectrum of possible realities, not just one best guess.
Exactly. And the third key benefit is unsupervised representation learning.
Okay.
DGMs naturally compress massive amounts of input data, say months of sensor readings, into a much smaller, lower dimensional thing called a latent vector.
Think of it like the data's essential ID card.
That's a perfect analogy. This compressed representation captures all the key features and is incredibly useful for downstream tasks, like instantly flagging anomalies in traffic flow or classifying transport modes without needing expensive labeled data.
We've established the why. Now let's get into the weeds of the how. If the goal is always maximizing that likelihood, these DGMs take wildly different paths to get there. How do we start classifying them?
We can split them based on their approach to density modeling. You have explicit density models, which are mathematically designed to directly compute the probability of any given data point.
And the others.
And then you have implicit density models, which just bypass that explicit probability calculation entirely. They just try to pass a kind of sophisticated taste test.
Well, let's start with a really famous explicit model, the variational autoencoder, or VAE. It's built around this encoder-decoder structure, right?
Right. And VAEs are genius because maximizing the true probability distribution is, well, it's computationally impossible for complex data. So they maximize a reliable, mathematically derived shortcut.
A shortcut called the evidence lower bound, or ELBO.
Exactly. And this shortcut creates a kind of internal tug-of-war for the model.
Tell us more about that tug-of-war. What's it balancing?
It's balancing two competing goals. First, the VAE has to minimize the reconstruction error, so how accurately the decoder can rebuild the input data.
Okay, so accuracy.
But second, it has to minimize the regularization term. This ensures the latent representation, that compressed ID card we talked about, stays simple and orderly. It forces it to align with a known distribution, like simple Gaussian noise.
So it's forcing the model to be both accurate and organized.
Yes. And that requirement for simplicity, for organization, that's often what leads to the outputs being perceptibly lower quality.
Right. That's the blurriness people always talk about with VAEs.
It is. The emphasis on regularization often means VAE outputs, especially for image-like data, like traffic speed contours, can look noticeably blurred or softened. They capture the general idea, but they miss the sharp edges.
So let's contrast that blurriness with generative adversarial networks, GANs, the primary implicit models. Their main motivation is just generating super high visual quality, and they skip that explicit math.
They do, because GANs don't try to calculate a probability distribution. They set up this high-stakes two-player simulation, a war game. You have the generator constantly creating fake data, and the discriminator, which acts as a ruthless critic, constantly trying to tell the real from the fake.
It's like an internal evolutionary battle where both sides get smarter and smarter until the generator is making stuff so good the discriminator is just guessing 50-50.
Exactly. And this dynamic implicitly drives the generator to capture the true distribution. Their fast generation is a single forward pass, and they achieve incredible quality.
But their big weakness is something called mode collapse.
A huge weakness. They get so good at generating one specific, perfect type of scenario, maybe perfectly free-flowing traffic, that they just forget to generate the rare, messy, but really important variations.
So if GANs are the speed and quality champs that can get stuck in a rut, let's jump back to the explicit side and talk about normalizing flows. You call these explicit tractable density models.
Yes, and they're elegant because they're mathematically transparent. They use a carefully designed series of invertible or bijective transformations.
Invertible meaning you can run them forwards and backwards.
Precisely. Imagine starting with incredibly complex chaotic traffic flow and running it backward through a series of mathematical steps until it just looks like simple random noise.
And the power there is that if you know the steps to get from complex to simple, you can also calculate the exact probability of any point along that complex path.
You've got it. Because every single step is invertible, they allow for the exact computation of the likelihood of any input data point. This makes them incredibly robust for density estimation tasks where you really need to be certain about probabilities.
And finally, the new kid on the block that everyone's talking about, diffusion models. They fall into that explicit intractable category, like VAEs.
Right. Diffusion models like DDPM are inspired by physics. They define a simple, known forward process. You just gradually add noise until your input data is pure statistical chaos.
Okay.
Then the model learns the reverse process, the iterative steps required to precisely denoise that chaos and reconstruct the original data.
So unlike a GAN, which tries to nail a perfect sample in one shot, a diffusion model takes hundreds of little steps, constantly refining a noisy image until a clean one emerges.
That step-by-step refinement is the key. It allows them to capture exceptional diversity and quality, often surpassing the realism of GANs.
But that iterative process is also their big trade-off.
It's their primary trade-off. Sampling is significantly slower and computationally demanding. You might need 500 to 1,000 steps to create a single sample.
Understanding the architecture really means understanding the trade-offs, which brings us to the famous generative learning trilemma.
Yes. Quality versus diversity, or mode coverage versus fast sampling. You can't currently have all three at once.
And this is the practical reality facing every single researcher.
It is. If you prioritize speed and visual quality, you probably lean towards a GAN, but you know you risk missing rare events because of mode collapse.
Right.
If you need diversity and fast sampling, you might choose a VAE or a flow, but you accept a potential drop in the sharpness of the output. And if you absolutely require maximum quality and coverage, well, you have to accept the high computational cost of a diffusion model.
So let's see this trilemma play out with the empirical comparison from the sources. First up, household travel survey data. This stuff is hard because it's discrete sociodemographics, trip purposes, travel modes. DGMs really prefer continuous spaces.
That's right. To handle that discrete nature, the researchers used a simple dequantization trick. They added tiny amounts of random noise to make the data just continuous enough for the DGMs to process.
And what happened when they tested the models?
The VAE outputs were often statistically uniform, meaning they didn't really capture the subtle relationships between attributes. The genes struggled even more severely with mode collapse. They'd only generate a few very common trip types.
But the normalizing flow model did much better here.
It did, by a lot. The normalizing flow's ability to model density exactly, thanks to that invertible structure, proved highly robust. It achieved the lowest error metrics like SRMSE and MAE. It was just far more accurate at replicating the actual statistical averages and distribution from the real survey data.
So for modeling discrete travel behavior accurately, the flow model won, hands down.
It really did.
Okay, now let's switch to continuous high-definition data. Highway traffic speed contours. This is image-like data, visualizing traffic speed across time and space.
And this data is critical because it contains very sharp structural features, especially the boundaries of traffic shock waves. When the DGMs were tested here, the architectural trade-offs just popped right back up.
The VAE outputs were blurred again.
Consistently blurred. Often they just resembled the dataset's average speed contour, even when they were scaled up with more parameters.
It's that penalty for prioritizing internal simplicity and regularization. You lose the visual fidelity.
Exactly. The GANs, on the other hand, focused on winning that realism more, and they produced much clearer, more diverse images. But to properly evaluate why they were better, you couldn't just rely on simple pixel differences.
This is where specialized metrics become so important for any practical application. What do they use to measure the quality of the traffic flow generation?
Two were essential. First, they used LPIPS, which stands for Learned Perceptual Image Patch Similarity. It basically assesses how well the generated image aligns with how a human visually perceives similarity.
So if it looks realistic to a planner, it scores well.
Exactly. And second, they used Sobel Edge MSE, which specifically measures structural fidelity. This is crucial for transportation because it focuses on how well the model replicates those sharp boundaries, those traffic shock waves.
Which are the most important features in a traffic simulation.
Absolutely. The GANs performed very well on both of these metrics, showing they had high visual quality and structural integrity.
That structural fidelity point feels massive. I mean, if you can't accurately simulate the boundary of a shockwave, your synthetic data is basically useless for safety testing or for optimizing how an autonomous vehicle should respond.
It connects directly to the future of this whole field. We need standardized evaluation metrics that capture not just realism, but also these safety-critical aspects and, ensure the scenarios actually obey physical laws.
And what about the challenge that traffic itself is always changing?
That's a massive headache. The dynamic characteristics of traffic data mean the distributions are constantly shifting. New autonomous vehicles, new policies like congestion pricing, even long-term urbanization.
It can all make a model trained on historical data obsolete pretty quickly.
Very quickly. So we urgently need strategies for detecting these distribution shifts and for updating the models on the fly.
Looking forward, we have to talk about the shift toward causal generative models. This feels like the ultimate frontier, moving past just correlation.
It is a fundamental leap. Traditional DGMs rely on statistical inference. If X happens, Y is likely to follow. Causality, however, is the relationship where one event directly influences another.
And putting that into a DGM makes it more robust.
Vastly more robust, especially in what we call out-of-distribution or ODE scenarios.
Give us an example of that. How would a causal DGM respond differently?
Okay, so a statistical DGM might observe that during a heat wave, there's a high likelihood of accidents. A causal DGM can understand why. The heat wave causes rubber to soften, which causes tire blowouts, which causes accidents.
Right.
Now, if a researcher introduces a completely unseen intervention, say a new policy mandating tires rated for extreme heat. The statistical model has no historical data to go on. But the causal DGM can simulate the intervention's consequences because it's modeling that specific cause and effect chain.
That is a massive potential for interpretability and control. You move beyond the black box prediction.
The model can explain why an output occurs. It could say, poor road design contributed to this predicted accident, for instance.
And that lets planners directly control the generative process. They can simulate targeted interventions. What if we add a lane here? What if we change this signal timing?
And they can reliably test the consequences on synthetic traffic before spending a single dollar on real-world implementation.
It's an incredibly exciting path forward. We're moving from just generating a realistic simulation of the current world to generating a controllable simulation of future possible worlds.
Absolutely. DGMs have moved so far past simple image generation. They are now essential, specialized tools for understanding these complex dynamic systems. Whether you're using normalizing flows for discrete travel behavior or GANs for high-quality continuous traffic flows, the field is advancing so rapidly.
So the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, is to remember the generative learning trilemma. Every DGM architecture, VAEs, GANs, flows, diffusion, has a specific trade-off baked right into its design. Choosing the right one depends entirely on whether your priority is the sharpest quality, capturing every possible variation, or lightning-fast generation.
And that leads to the final provocative thought for you to consider. If current DGMs excel at generating complex outcomes based on observed past data, how dramatically will the integration of causal reasoning change transportation planning? It could allow us not just to predict what will happen, but to reliably simulate the specific consequences of interventions we haven't even tried yet.